Hello everyone, I hope you're having an amazing day. Today we're diving into a story that will leave you questioning everything. What would you do if the person you love might actually be your own sibling? A shocking slap, a hidden past, and a truth that could destroy an entire family. If you find this story gripping, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episodes. The afternoon felt unusually calm, almost too calm, like the air was holding its breath before something broke. James and Diep were sitting outside after a long day of selling vegetables at the market. The sun was low, painting everything in warm gold. Diep was counting the last few bills, smiling in that quiet, content way of hers. "We did pretty well today," she said softly. "If things keep going like this, maybe next year we can rent a bigger place, or maybe even open a small shop of our own." James looked at her, not at the money in her hands, but at the hope in her eyes. She wasn't dreaming about luxury. She wasn't asking for a mansion or a car. She just wanted stability, a simple future, a peaceful life. "And maybe," she continued, hesitating just a little, "we won't have to hide anymore. Maybe one day your family will accept me." James reached for her hand. "Diep," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, I'm not letting go of you. I've chosen you, and I don't regret it." She smiled, but there was still a faint shadow in her eyes. "Even if your father never agrees?" "Even then." That was the moment the gate opened. Neither of them heard it at first. They only felt the shift in the air. When James looked up, his heart sank. Standing just a few steps away was Mr. Huan, his father. No warning, no phone call, just that cold, unblinking stare. Diep immediately stood up. "Uncle, I didn't know you were coming." Mr. Huan didn't respond. His eyes were locked on James. "I told you," he said slowly, each word sharp, "not to see this girl again." James stood, instinctively placing himself slightly in front of Diep. "Dad!" Before he could finish, the sound cracked through the yard. A slap. James's face turned to the side, the sting burning across his cheek. Diep gasped. "Uncle, please." Mr. Huan's voice was ice. "I warned you. I told you to stay away from her." James didn't raise his hand. He didn't step back. He slowly turned his face forward again and looked straight at his father. "I'm almost 30, he said quietly. "I have the right to choose my own life." "You don't understand why I'm stopping you," Mr. Huan shot back. "Then explain it," James replied, his voice rising for the first time. "Is it because of her background or because of your past?" For the first time, something flickered in Mr. Huan's eyes. Diep looked confused. "James, what are you talking about?" James didn't answer her. His gaze never left his father. "I've been looking into things," he continued. "I found out about Ms. Dieu." The name hung in the air. Mr. Huan's jaw tightened. "You and Ms. Dieu knew each other," James said. "Not just casually. You had a relationship." "That's enough," Mr. Huan said sharply. "And the timeline matches," James pressed on. "The year Diep was born, the months before that. You were on a business trip, but you weren't out of the country. You were here." Silence. Diep's fingers trembled. "James, what are you saying?" Mr. Huan finally spoke, but his voice had changed. It wasn't angry now, it was heavy. "There are things," he said slowly, "that knowing won't make better." James stepped forward. "If there's nothing to hide, then say it clearly." Huan looked at Diep, then back at his son, and then he said the words that shattered everything. "If I told you that she could be your biological sister, what would you do?" Diep felt the world tilt. "What?" There was no proof, no document, No DNA test, just that possibility. That terrifying possibility. James stared at his father. "Based on what?" he demanded. "Do you have evidence, or are you just trying to scare me into leaving her?" Mr. Hahn didn't answer directly. He turned away slightly. "You think I enjoy this? You think I would invent something like that? Then prove it," James shot back. "I'm not 100% certain," Mr. Hahn admitted, almost under his breath. "But the timing, the circumstances, it's possible." "Possible," James repeated. "That's not the same as true." That night, after Diep left in tears and Mr. Hahn walked away without another word, James couldn't sleep. The next morning, he began digging deeper. He went to the old hospital where Diep was born. The building was worn down, files stored in dusty cabinets. After hours of persuasion, he found an elderly nurse who had worked there decades ago. "I don't remember everything," she said, adjusting her glasses. "But there was a woman. Yes, she was quiet, didn't have much family with her." "Was there a man?" James asked carefully. "Someone wealthy? Someone who didn't want to be seen?" The nurse hesitated. "There was a car, a nice one. I remember because it didn't fit the area. A man came once asking questions, but I never saw him inside the delivery room." That wasn't proof, just another fragment. Then James visited the old neighborhood where Ms. Dieu had once lived. An elderly neighbor remembered her. "She disappeared for a few months," the woman said. "Came back later with a baby. People talked, you know how it is. But she never explained." Another fragment. James checked his father's old travel records. There it was. A trip labeled as a business inspection. The dates overlapped with the time Diep would have been conceived. But again, nothing concrete, no DNA test, no written confession, just pieces that almost fit. Days later, James went back to confront his father. "If there was even a chance," James said, standing in his father's office, "why didn't you tell me earlier?" Mr. Hahn leaned back in his chair. He looked older than usual. "Because I wasn't sure, and because I hoped it wouldn't come to this." "Or because you were afraid," James said. "Afraid your past would destroy everything." Mr. Hahn closed his eyes briefly. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "But I never meant for my children to pay for them." "Then why bring this up now?" "Because if she really is your sister," Mr. Hahn said, his voice cracking for the first time, "and you continue this relationship, the damage would be irreversible." James fell silent. For a moment, he remembered something else. His stepmother. The woman Hung once resented. The woman he himself had misunderstood for years. She had donated blood when Hung was in a critical accident. She had quietly paid off Hung's debts without telling anyone. She had endured cold treatment but never defended herself. Not all adults were heartless. Not all secrets were selfish. Maybe his father wasn't trying to control him. Maybe he was trying to protect something. But protect what? James felt torn in 3 directions. Believe his father and walk away. Ignore him and stay with Diep. Or take the final step. Do a DNA test and face whatever truth came with it. "I can't leave her," James said finally. "Not because of a maybe." That evening, he stood in front of Diep's house. In his hand was a brown envelope filled with copies of hospital notes, travel records, and handwritten statements. Not proof, just suspicion. He raised his hand to knock, then lowered it. Across the street, in the shadow of a parked car, Mr. Hahn was watching. James whispered to himself, barely audible, "Sometimes the truth isn't the scariest thing. It's whether we're brave enough to face it." He closed his eyes, and the screen fades to black. The night air felt heavier than before, like the world itself was waiting for James to make a choice. He stood in front of Diep's house longer than he realized, the envelope still in his hand. Across the street, Mr. Huan remained inside the darkened car, watching but not interfering. It wasn't control anymore. It was fear. James finally knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. Diep's eyes were swollen. She had clearly been crying, but she still forced herself to stand straight. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. "We need to talk." She stepped aside without another word. Inside, the room felt smaller than usual. The normal warmth between them had been replaced with something fragile. James placed the envelope on the table but didn't open it yet. "Is it true?" Diep asked. "What your father said, do you believe it?" "I don't know what to believe," James answered honestly. "That's the problem." He sat down, running his hands through his hair. "I went to the hospital where you were born. I talked to people who knew your mother. I checked my father's travel history." Diep's expression shifted from confusion to hurt. "You investigated me?" "I investigated the situation," he corrected gently. "Not you." "And what did you find?" she asked. "Nothing solid, just pieces. A nurse remembers a wealthy man visiting. A neighbor remembers your mother disappearing for months. The dates match one of my father's trips." Diep's voice trembled. "But that doesn't prove anything." "No," James said. "It doesn't." Silence settled between them again. Diep walked to the window and stared outside. "All my life," she said slowly, "I never knew who my real father was. My mom never talked about him. Whenever I asked, she would just say, 'It's better not to know.' I thought maybe he abandoned us, or maybe he was already married." James swallowed. "Did she ever mention my father?" Diep shook her head. "Never." James stood and walked closer. "There's no DNA test, no official record, just a possibility." "And that possibility is enough to tear us apart?" she asked. Before James could answer, there was another knock on the door. Both of them froze. James opened it. Mr. Huan stood there, no longer hiding in the shadows. "I knew you'd come," Mr. Huan said quietly. "Then come inside," Diep said unexpectedly. James looked surprised, but she stepped aside firmly. "If this is about my life too, I deserve to hear everything." Mr. Huan entered slowly, his posture less rigid than before. He didn't sit. "I never wanted this to come out like this," he began, "and I'm not here to accuse anyone." "Then why say it?" James asked. "Why tell me she could be my sister if you're not even sure?" Mr. Huan exhaled. "Because I saw the direction you were heading. I saw how serious you were. If there was even a small chance, I couldn't stay silent." Diep looked directly at him. "Did you love my mother?" The question caught him off guard. "Yes," he admitted after a pause. "I did." "And did you know she was pregnant?" Diep pressed. "I suspected," he said. "But she left before we could talk about it. And at the time, I was already tied to responsibilities, to family, to a marriage that was arranged." "So you chose your reputation," James said bitterly. "I chose stability," Mr. Huan corrected, though his voice lacked conviction. "I told myself it was better for everyone." Diep's hands clenched slightly. "My mother raised me alone. Whatever happened between you two, she never blamed anyone. She just worked." Mr. Huan's eyes softened. "She was strong." "Then why bring this up now?" James demanded again. "Because I recently found something," Mr. Huan replied. James stiffened. "What?" "An old letter. From her. She never sent it to me, but it was returned to my old address years later and stored away. I only found it recently." "What did it say?" Diep asked. Mr. Huan hesitated. "She wrote that if anything happened to her, there was a possibility I should know about. She didn't confirm, she didn't accuse. She just said there was a chance. A chance, James repeated. Yes. Why didn't you show me the letter? James demanded. Because I wasn't ready, Mr. Hoan admitted. And because once you read it, there would be no turning back. Diep's voice was steady now. Then show it to us. Mr. Hoan looked at both of them. If we take this further, it means DNA tests, public records, questions from relatives. The company could be affected. Our family name... I don't care about the company, James cut in. But I do, Mr. Hoan said sharply, then softened again. Not because of money, because of the employees, the people who depend on it. James felt that familiar internal conflict rising again. He remembered his stepmother, the woman who had once rushed to the hospital when Hung was in a coma, the woman who had donated blood without hesitation, the woman who secretly paid Hung's gambling debts to protect him from humiliation. She had protected the family quietly, even when misunderstood. Maybe his father believed he was protecting them too. But protecting them from what? Truth or consequences? So what now? Diep asked calmly. Do we live in doubt forever? James looked at her. No. Mr. Hoan frowned. What are you planning? We test, James said firmly. DNA, private. No public announcement, just the three of us. And if the result says, Mr. Hoan began, then we deal with it, James replied. As adults. Diep inhaled slowly. And if it says we're not related? James turned to his father. Then you accept her. Mr. Hoan didn't answer immediately. After a long silence, he said quietly, if the result is clear, I won't interfere again. Diep studied him carefully. You promise? I promise. The room felt different now, not lighter, but clearer. James picked up the envelope he had brought. Everything inside here, he said, is just suspicion. I'm tired of living in suspicion. He looked at Diep. Whatever happens, I'm not running. She nodded. Neither am I. Mr. Hoan moved toward the door but stopped before leaving. Without turning around, he said, I never meant to hurt either of you. Sometimes we make decisions thinking they protect everyone, but they create bigger storms. James didn't respond. After Mr. Hoan left, Diep sat down slowly. Are you scared? She asked. Yes, James admitted, but not of the truth. Then what? Of losing you. Diep reached for his hand again. We won't know until we know. Outside, the street was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the calm before a storm. It was the calm before a decision. And somewhere in that silence, 3 lives were waiting for a single answer that could either break them apart or finally set them free. James's peaceful moment with Diep is shattered when his father, Mr. Hoan, suddenly appears and slaps him for continuing their relationship. In a shocking confrontation, Mr. Hoan reveals a disturbing possibility. Diep could be James's biological sister. With no solid proof, only fragments from the past, an old letter from Diep's mother and suspicious timelines, James is thrown into emotional chaos. Refusing to walk away based on a maybe, he begins his own investigation, digging through hospital records and confronting his father about his hidden past. As tension rises, Diep demands answers, and Mr. Hoan admits he once loved her mother but never confirmed the truth. The episode ends with a bold decision, a private DNA test to uncover reality once and for all. Love, family, and reputation now hang in the balance, waiting for a single result that could change everything.